Welcome to another episode of Software Explorations, Concept and Overviews with yours truly, Tech Coach Ralph, where we are engineered to win. In today's episode, we are going to go over the page object model. So let's get into it a little bit. So this came about by someone asking me, hey, do you have a video specifically on the page object model? And I was like, let me check. And turns out I didn't, where the page object model is one of the most important concepts in automated testing. So I said, well, since you asked, you shall receive. And we are now making this video about the page object model, which will give you a good understanding of how it works and the reason that we use it and all that good stuff about using the page object model to make your automated test much more cleaner. So let's get into it. All right, so like I said, the topic for today is the page object model. All right, so what is our agenda for today? We are going to be going over what is the page object model, the reason that we use it, what are the key concepts of using the page object model, what exactly are page objects. We're going to talk about test methods, object locators. Then we're going to see two examples of the page object model in action. And then we're going to talk about the best practices for implementing the page object model, some of the challenges and the solutions when we're implementing the page object model, then some tools that you can use when implementing the page object model, and then the page object model in some different contexts. So let's get started. So what the heck is the page object model anyways? So the page object model is a design pattern used in software automation testing to create a structured and maintainable framework for testing web applications. It is primarily used in test automation frameworks like Selenium, but the concept can be applied to other testing tools as well. The main goal of the page object model is to separate the test code from the underlying details of the user interface. So before we go on, if you think about it like this, right? Pretty much almost everything that we see would use the concept of the page object model, because for instance, when you look at a car, right, from the outside and sometimes from the inside, right, you just see the actual vehicle, you see the four tires, you see the body. If you're inside the car, you can see the dashboard, you can see where the radio goes, the chairs, all of that, right? However, you do not see the underlying details of what actually makes the car go, right? You're not seeing the engine from the outside. You're not seeing all the components of the engine. You're not seeing the transmission, all the components of the transmission, the fuel system, all of that stuff, and not to mention all the other little electronic details that are also involved. You don't see any of that, right? And all those components are put together in order to make the car go. And that can be applied to just about anything. So why do we use the page object model? So the page object model, it brings maintainability, reusability. It's easy to read the code so readability. And then the maintenance effort is dramatically reduced when using the page object model. It allows a better chance for collaboration amongst a team when it comes to automating. It allows our tests to be way more scalable and our tests to be more stable as well, which is a big problem when it comes to automation. And it allows for the efficiency when executing your test. All right. So what are some of the key concepts of the page object model? Well, I guess to start off, page objects would definitely be a key concept, right? And then it takes the UI, the user interface, it abstracts the elements from that, right? So you have the user interface, and now you can pull out the actual elements that are part of that, right? It also includes a separation of concerns, putting things in a proper order. Like we mentioned before, it should be reusable. right? You should be able to reuse your page objects. And it also touches on the single responsibility principle. So we don't want one thing, or we don't want many things doing many things. We want one thing to be responsible for one thing, and then we go from there. All right. Another key concept are the locators, right? I think that might be the most important one, right? The locators. When it comes to automation in general, right? When it comes to web automation, locators are super, super important, right? So another key concept is initializing your page objects, the assertions, right? How you handle your assertions. Where are the proper place that your validation should go? Another key concept is the page navigation. How do you handle page navigation? I know I personally handle the page navigation in the page object model differently than is traditionally taught, right? And then consistency and naming convention is very, very important across your page objects and across your automation in general, or across coding standards in general, right? Consistency and naming conventions are super important. And lastly, encapsulation is another key concept of the page object model, because you do not want everything to be exposed. You want only the things that are necessary to be exposed to actually be exposed. All right. So what are page objects? So page objects are at the core of the POM, the page object model. It only makes sense, right? Page objects should be the core of the page object model. Each web page or component of a web application is represented as a separate class or object. The page object encapsulates all of the interactions and properties of that specific page or component, abstracting away the underlying HTML structure and implementation details. Page objects provide a clean and structured interface for test scripts to interact with the UI. So what the heck does that mean, right? So let's put it like this. I'll give you this example. When I first wrote my automated tests, right? And let's go with Selenium because that's the most popular framework. It was just one test file that said, all right, go to this website, click on this link in the navigation. Now click on this, let's say it was an e-commerce page. So click on this product page. Right? This is all in the same test script, right? Click on this product page, click on the add to cart button, then go to cart, and then click on the checkout button, fill out the checkout information, and submit the payment, right? So all of this was in one test file. Now the problem that happens is we don't only have one test, we have multiple tests, right? So we end up having to, let's say we have to do another variation of the test. So let's say the first test is checking out as a registered user. Now we have another test where we want to do as a guest user. So in order to do the guest user with the way that I just described, we would have to do this. We would have the code duplicated, and we would have to make a slight modification, right? So what the page object model offers us is that each web page is its own class or object. So that means that I would have a class or object for the home page, where it would take care of all the interactions that I would do on the home page, and then I would have one for the navigation, where it would take care of all of the interactions, right, that I do on the navigation, and go so forth for the search results page, the product page, the cart page. So now we end up having let's see, throughout that particular process, maybe 6 or 7 separate classes or objects, right? And then on the test script, I'm calling and saying, all right, call in the home page, and I want this interaction on the home page, right? So, and then I say, now call in the navigation. I want in this interaction from the navigation to be called, and so forth for the search results page, the product page, the cart page, the checkout page, right? I'm calling each of those separately. So now when I go to use my, when I go to do the flow for the guest checkout after I'm completed with the registered user checkout, I can reuse all of that code, right, into the next page. And now, if I need to make an update to something in the flow, maybe a locator, maybe the development team made a minor change, I can just go into that page object, make the change, and then all the tests that call that page object automatically gets updated. And that's what the purpose is of the page object, and that is what the page objects are. All right, so let's move on. So, test methods. What are test methods? Test methods refer to the methods defined within page objects that are used by test scripts to interact with and verify the behavior of web pages or components. These test methods encapsulate specific actions and verifications that can be performed on the UI elements of a page. So, what this means is that, so let's say we have a website where we have to log in, right? So we can have a page object call login, and then we define the selectors, the elements, right? So we would say on a login page, would have an element for username, would have an element for password, and would have an element for clicking the login button. So that's the most basic one, right? We most likely would have forgot your password link. We have new user sign up link, something to that extent. But let's go with username, password, and login button, right? So now what happens is inside of our test methods, right? So the way that I would do it, right? I would create a test method for entering the username, right? Where you would say you'd use Selenium or whichever testing framework of your choice, right? Automation framework of your choice. You would say enter username, and then you'd use that selector for the username to send the keys of the username that you're entering, right? And I would be passing a parameter for the username that I would be typing into there. And then I would say one for enter password, right? Where I would be passing the parameters of the password that would be entered when that method is executed. And then I'd have another one that says click login button, right? Now I'd have an additional method that brings it all together, which would be login to account or website or whatever the case may be, right? So then in that login, it would pass the parameters of username and password. And that method would call the enter username method. It would call the enter password method, and it would call the click login button method, right? So that one test method is being used to log into the website. And now in our test script, when I want to log in, I would just say call the login page and call in the test method on the login page, call log into website or log into account, whatever the case may be, whatever you name the method, but that's the one that you would call, right? So that is the way that the test methods would work on the site. And we will, towards the end, when we're getting into the page object model in action, we will see a more concrete example of that. So to continue with the test methods are a fundamental part of the page object model. They provide a clean and structured interface for the test scripts to interact with the application's user interface, right? So how will our test scripts interact with the actual website? Right. So now the next thing is object locators. To me, one of the most, this is what makes or breaks your automated test. And it's not even, and the object locators aren't even they're not even part of the page object model specifically, because any way that you choose to automate, whether you automate in the test scripts, which highly do not recommend you do. But let's say you are just getting started and you want to create the most basic automated test. So the object locators are just as important, because the object locators are what will make or break your automated test, right? So object locators are a crucial component used to identify and locate elements on a web page or within a web page application. These locators are used by page objects to interact with elements such as clicking buttons, filling out forms, or verifying the state of elements. And if you are well versed in HTML and CSS, then you will do very well at choosing the right object locators that will reduce your test failing for no valid reason. Right. So what are the types of object locators? So the number one object locator is the ID, right? The reason that IDs are so important is because on a web page, there should only be one ID per element, right? So whenever you can find ID, you go with the ID. However, IDs are not always available, so that leads to you can use object locators of the XPath or using like an XML, right, to navigate towards the page. You can use CSS selectors, right? So for me, I like to, if once the ID is not available, I like to go with CSS selectors. And then if CSS selectors are not available, I'll go with the XPath. But another important one is the name. For me, I typically see names are part of forms. So when I am automating, like filling out a form, those form elements, I will most likely be able to find a name to associate it with or an ID. But when it comes outside of the forms, typically you don't find the names, the name locator type, right? Then there's, for me, the ones that I use the least is the class name, the tag name, the link name, and the partial link text. The class name, like you can, if an element has just like one class, then you can probably use that. But the problem with classes are that they can be reused many times throughout the whole HTML. So it is very difficult to use. To me, it's very difficult to use the class name as an object locator. The same with tag names, right? If there's only one particular tag on the page, then that'll work. But usually there are many tags on the page. And by tag, I mean like a paragraph tag or H1 tag or H2 tag, a link tag. All those tags, there's going to be tons and tons of them on the page. So usually that is not going to be your number one option. And then we have the link text or partial link text. I am not a big fan of using link text or even partial link text because those can have multiple links on the page. So I try to avoid that, especially like because any one of these is always going to find the first one on the page unless you specify with the maybe the XPath or the CSS selector to choose a different position. So if you want a link that says click here, but there's like 5 of them on the page, it's going to be very difficult to use the link text or the partial link text to pick that 5th one on the page. So I typically stick with the ID, the XPath, the CSS selectors, right? And there is something called like when you're creating like when the HTML is being built, right? To add in like test data IDs, which I typically use. I typically like it is a good practice to have your developers to add those test data IDs. And I'll typically use CSS selectors or XPath to choose those. 9 times out of 10, I'm going to use CSS selectors. But for those rare occasions when you can't use a CSS selector, then I'll end up using the XPath, right? But for me, I typically go with ID or name if I'm doing a form or a CSS selector. And then once all of those 3 fail, then I'm going to go with the XPath. I almost never ever go to the other column with the class name, the tag name, the link text, or the partial link text. All right, let's keep going. So page object model in action. All right. So from this example, right, this is for a login page, very similar to what I was mentioning right earlier. So this says, all right, the web driver is private. So now we're going to use by from the Selenium WebDriver. Like when that's imported, we're using by, and we're going to say we're going to call this attribute username, right? And we're going to say find it by the ID called username, and the same thing for password. Find it by the ID of password, and then we're going to say find by the ID of login button, right? It would be nice if all automation was that easy, but in the real world, that is not the case, right? So let's keep going. So it says, now this class is called login page. So we're going to have a constructor. Constructors have these in Java. Constructors have the same name as the class, right? So we're saying the constructor login page, and then we're passing to it the web driver right? Which it's called driver. Okay. So now let's move down a little bit to the actual test methods that are being implemented, right? So public void enter username, like I was mentioning earlier, and it's passing a string called username, and it's saying driver dot find the element of username field based on what was defined up here, right? Username field. So driver find the element by the username field and then send the keys of the parameter called username, right? Right here. And then same thing here for enter password, and it's sending a string called password. So driver find element by password field and send keys password. And then like we mentioned earlier, click login button, driver find element, login button, and click that button, right? So this is pretty much what I was explaining earlier, but me, I would probably take it a one step further, and I'd create a method called public void log into website or account, whatever the case may be. And then in that I'll pass a string for username, I'll pass a string for password, and I'll just have in that method, it would say enter username, right? And I'd be passing in the username parameter, then enter password, be passing in the password parameter, and then I'll just say click login button. So now we have one simple method, right? In our test scripts, we have one simple method where you can just say you call login to website, and then you say username tech coach Ralph, password ABC123, and now once that line gets executed, it is going into this enter username to do this part, and then it's going to enter password to do this part, and then it's going to click login button to successfully log you into the website. All right. So let's take another look at the page object model in action. You can go to this GitHub URL. This is one of my GitHubs where you can see this restaurant stores technical project that I did a while back. And now let's look at it in actual action. So I can give you this is going to be a more realistic view of what you would encounter on a day-to-day basis when implementing the page object model. All right. So the criteria for this technical project, right? It was to go to the homepage of Restaurant Stores, search for stainless steel work table, check the search results, ensuring every product has the word table in its title, and the last of the found items in the cart. So you add the last of the found item in the cart, and then you empty the cart, right? So what I was saying earlier, right? When you're new to automation, most likely what you're going to do is you're going to write the test all. So let's ignore this stuff right here, right? We're going to ignore all of this. You're going to go into your test. So this test method is called test add product to cart via product detail page. You're going to add all of your code here that says, all right, click on the home page, and you're going to have your locators, everything in here, right? But this is bad practice to do that. So what we're going to show here is the page, like how I implemented the page object model. Okay. So we're not going to go into the whole details of the framework and everything like that. What we're going to do is first we're going to, so we know what the test is. We're going to look at over here. I have a package. So this is written in Java. I have a package called pages. And in the pages package, I have my page objects. I have my home page object. I have my main navigation. I have my product details. I have my search results, and I have my shopping cart, right? We're not going to go through each one of these files, but what I can do, so here you can see there's stuff here. There's nothing under home because when I got to home, I went straight into the main navigation. There was nothing for me to click on home, right? So I didn't create any page objects for that. But let's go into the main navigation, right? So we'll look at the main navigation. We'll look at the search results. So inside the main navigation, and here I used what is part of Selenium called the page factory, right? Which is an extension of what the page object model can do. Okay. So, and there's some stuff that I'm going to skip around because they're not necessarily relevant to the page object model. There are just, because they're just framework things that I added to make this work a lot better. Okay. So here's our class, main navigation. Okay. And what we did here, we have our constructor, which is saying we want to be able to initialize the main navigation inside of our test script. Okay. So then, so using the page factory, I'm saying initialize the page factory, which we'll get into down here with this page, right? Using the driver that I'm passing here and this page. Okay. So if I wasn't using the page factory, it would be like we saw in the example where we just say by logo and then we say what is the path to the logo. But using the page factory, which I would highly recommend if you're automating through Java, right? I'm saying it makes it a lot easier, right? So I say find by, and I say the CSS, and this is the CSS path to the logo, right? And then I name it as a private web element logo. And then the same thing for search input value and for search button, right? So I'm defining all of my locators up here, right? And whether you're doing the page factory or not, you still want to define all your locators towards the top, right? To make it very clean and organized. And then I'm going to say, so now I'm setting my getters, right? And I say get logo because these are private. My getters are going to be public, right? So that way I can always access my elements, but without giving direct access where they can be modified, right? So I'm having them protected. I'm encapsulating them, okay? So now I have get logo, get search input field, get search button, all of those things, right? So if we keep going, now we get to, so now I get to an actual test method, right? So I'm saying enter search term in search field, and I'm passing a string called search term, right? So now I'm saying enter text into input field, and now I'm going to say, so here I'm using part of the framework that I created, right? But I could, so I'm saying enter the text into the search input field, right? And passing the get search input field, and this is the text that I'm passing, right? And here, click the search button. Like I said, I'm using a framework, but I'm saying click the search button, right? And then here, this is the method where I'm saying, all right, search for the item on the site, right? And I'm passing the search term, and I'm saying enter the search term into the field. So I'm calling this method right here, and I'm passing the search term that's going to be passed into it. And then I'm saying click the search button. So I'm calling this right here, right? So now we'll see inside of the test script once we get back to it, or we're going to take a look at it now. Inside of the test script, it just says search for the item on the site, right? And I'm passing this, and it's going to execute all of this. And it's going to be calling the selector that I defined up top for get search input field, right? So it might be a little confusing, but once you actually get your hands on it and you actually do it, you'll see it'll make a lot more sense. Listening to the theory is one thing, but actually doing it and becoming a practitioner is a totally different thing, all right? So now we continue. So if we look quickly at the actual test case for test add to flow, right? So here we were just looking at the main navigation. So here I'm defining, all right, I'm saying main nav equals new main navigation, and I'm passing the get driver that I have from the framework. If you don't have a framework, you'd just be passing driver, right? Because you're defining it here. But because this was a technical project, the code had to be very clean. So we're passing it from our framework to get driver, okay? But if we go down to over here, now we're saying main nav, right? Search for item on site, and we're searching for stainless work table, right? And now this is calling from our page object here, and it's calling that test method for test for item on site, and our test method is calling the enter search term in search field and the click search button. So that is the page object model in action that way, right? Same for the search results. We pretty much do the same exact thing, but this one is specifically for the search results page. And that's how you would go by implementing the page object model on each of these pages, okay? So let's jump back over to our presentation real quick. And if you have any questions about this, do not hesitate to ask in the comments, and I will be sure to answer you. If you want me to go into more details about any of this, let me know, and I'll be more than happy to do that for you. Okay, so let's jump back to our presentation. So that was the page object and model, a real project example. It's not going to be like it's never going to be like a step by step, very very easy thing. It's going to take work. So and that's why I showed you the easy part and I showed you a more complex real life project because that is what we're going to aspire to be amazing QA automation engineers. Okay. So here. All right. So what are some best practices for using the page object model, right? We definitely want to make sure that we have good locators, right? Because good locators are the foundation, right? If you have bad locators, then your tests are going to be failing all the time, and it's not going to. You're always going to be maintaining and cleaning up, right? Another thing is we want to have good naming conventions because you want to be able to easily understand what your tests are doing. If you come back to it in 2 months, you don't want to be totally lost, right? In addition, you also want other people who are contributing to the test to actually know what's going on, and that when they're reading like you don't want it to make absolutely no sense to them. So you do want it to have good naming conventions. You also want the single responsibility principle, right? And that way, what that means is that one thing is doing one thing, right? So you have the page objects dedicated to, like for the main navigation, right? It's dedicated to what's on the main navigation, and it's not mixing in what's on the product page or the search result page. It's like, all right, this is for the navigation, and I'm going to take care of the navigation here and being able to go to the home page, to the login page, to the whatever case may be, but it only responsible for going to those pages, clicking on those links, and not for actually what happens on those pages. All right. We also want a separation of concerns, right? So part of the separation of concerns, right? The way that I do it as well is you'll see me create a method for enter username. You see me create a method for enter password where it's doing like just about one thing in there. But then I will create a method which will bring those three things together because that's going to be the most common action. But I also have the option to call those methods on their own if I need to, right? So let's say I have a test where well that wouldn't even work, right? But because yeah, so I was gonna say, let's say I have a test where I want to enter the username but not enter the password. But even with that, I can still do it because I can leave the password field blank, right? Or I can leave the username field blank and click. But the thing is, the separation of concerns. I'm creating smaller methods that I can call into bigger methods, but I can always execute those smaller methods when necessary, right? I'm not forced to do a whole flow where it has like tons of conditions. I can always call in a single method, right? Which also goes to the reusable components because I can reuse that enter username whenever I need to. I can reuse that enter password whenever I need to. I can reuse click login whenever I need to, or I can use that whole entire method that's going to log into the website whenever I need to, wherever I need to, right? So on any page, I can always call in the login page, and I can call in the main navigation, and I can click on whatever I need from those, right? And then assertions. This is very important in best practice, right? Because I will see many people doing their assertions inside of the page objects, but to me, that is a big no-no. I think that it's best to do your assertions inside of your actual test scripts because when reading through the test script, you will know exactly what you're trying to validate. And from test script to test script, your validations change. So I would say keep your assertions in your test scripts and not inside your page objects. Okay. So, what are some challenges and solutions to the page object model? So, let's go through the challenges, right? Because to me, there's like one main solution, but the challenges maintenance and overhead, right? And we have like synchronization issues where there's timing things that mess you up. Like one of the most annoying ones where you get like where you get stale elements or the test is going too fast and you need to adjust your weights and your there's so many different type of weights and in Selenium at least, right? And you know how you deal with that in other testing frameworks. It's you just have to figure it out, right? Like you have to read the documentation and everything. There's flaky tests where you run a test now and it passes, and then you run it like after, and then it fails, and then you run it again and it passes. So you just have to adjust your test, right? Then there's like, for people who may not be well versed in choosing the right selectors, there's sometimes you have to go into complex selectors to choose the right one, right? Performance overhead. Um, Depending on how much you try to extract and how many classes you're using, if you're calling every page object when they don't need to be, you're going to have performance overhead. Then browsers react differently. So you're going to have to write your test. Sometimes you have to write some if statements or some switch statements in order to properly handle browser compatibility. There's sometimes you're going to get duplicate code. As much as we try to avoid duplicate code, right? And here's an example of duplicate code, right? You have, let's say you have two test methods, right? Or two test scripts. One for checking out as a logged in user, one for checking out as a guest user. On both of those, you're going to have a lot of the same code, right? Navigating to the site. Um, even when you're using the page object, right? You're going to have a lot of the same code until you get to a certain point and then it changes. But that's the nature of the game. So you just need to properly maintain your code. And there's scalability because the bigger a website is, the more pages that it has, it can become pretty big. And then going from like, I'll call it like bad automation practices to like a very nice, clean page object model. There's an educational curve to it. It's going to take some time, but it is well worth it in the end. And then another annoying one is the dynamic UI elements, things that do not like, let's say an ID gets generated on the fly. So it's almost impossible to automate that, but there is a way to do it, right? There is a way that you can target part of it, or maybe you use a CSS selector or an XPath to target something else, right? So there's definitely a way to do it, but it can be a very big challenge, but there's always solutions for it, right? Then there's like third-party components, which is another annoying one where like you're dealing with, let's say you're trying to automate a choosing reservation flow, right? And you have to automate the calendar that's being chosen, or there's some component that's being loaded from another website that it's required to go through for part of the flow, but it's not necessarily under test because it's not part of your development, but you still need to automate it and it might be tricky to automate it, right? Then we have test data management because test data is a key component of automation testing, but where do you store your test data, right? What level you store your data? It's not necessarily part of the page object model, but it is a part of automation. And when using the page object model, you are going to have to pass test data in, right? Another one is the mobile and responsive design because with mobile websites are maybe more popular than desktop designs now, right? So you need to be able to automate the mobile, and that might take either automating on a simulator, on a actual device. So you might have to have many different forms of the automation, one for mobile, one for the desktop, and then it's responsive. So getting that all taken care of, right? Then we also have testing in multiple environments because if you're working in on a development team, you're going to have to automate possibly locally on your computer, like to run locally on your computer, to run in maybe a development environment or a staging environment. And sometimes you might have to also run in production, so you need to be able to set up your automated test, which that also goes like outside of the page object model. But just in general, when you're doing automation testing, you're going to have to take care of like all of these challenges are going to produce themselves, even if they're not specifically related to the page object model. Those are going to be things you need to consider to get taken care of. All right. So what are some of the implementation tools that we use for automating in the page object model, right? So implementing the page object model typically involves using a combination of programming languages, testing frameworks, and automation tools. So the automation tools slash library that you typically are going to use, which there's many of them, but the most common ones right now are Selenium WebDriver, Playwright, and Cypress, right? So Selenium WebDriver that spans across a multitude of languages. Probably maybe the most popular one is in Java, but they also have it available in Python. They have it available in JavaScript. They have it available in C Sharp. But there's also Playwright. There's also Cypress. Cypress, I believe it's primarily for JavaScript. Playwright, they have it in JavaScript and they have it in Python, right? So then we have our testing framework, which in Java you're going to have testng or JUnit. In Python, you can have PyTest, but there's other different ones, and also like they have Cucumber. There's also Behave. In C Sharp, there's NUnit. So many different testing frameworks based on the language that you're using, and that's going to help you actually execute your test, right? Then we have the CI/CD pipeline, where you can be using Jenkins, you can be using TeamCity, you can be using Circle CI, and there are tons of other ones as well. But to me, those are probably like the three most popular. You can also actually use GitHub, I believe, to be able to use as your CI/CD pipeline as well, right? Then we have our IDEs and our text editors. I personally am a fan of the JetBrains suite, but some other people really enjoy using VS Code. So it's whatever your preference is, whatever you're comfortable with, right? And then there's version control. So where you can store different versions of your code and you can retrieve those versions. You can give different branches. Two popular ones are Git, which is probably the most popular right now, but before that it used to be SVN. But Git is the most popular to me right now. And you can store your code through like maybe GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLabs or whatever the case may be, right? So many options of storing your code. Okay. So what is the page object model in different contexts, right? So while the page object model is commonly associated with test automation, its principles of encapsulation, modularity, and separation of concerns can be adapted to different scenarios to improve code organization, maintainability, and reusability. So technically, like I say, right, the page object model is not directly related to automation. It is a design pattern, and you can have the page object model in whatever development style that you're doing. And you can also have it, like you can use it for like testing APIs, for testing desktop applications, for testing web applications, right? Whatever the case may be, you should be able to, like, I think I've even implemented it in automating database testing, right? So you can implement it in any way, shape, or form. It's really what's important is the principles of encapsulation, modularity, and the separation of concerns, right? And you have and I would say focus very much on your organization, your maintainability, and your reusability. All right. So, in conclusion, we discussed what the page object model is, why we should use the page object model, some key concepts of the page object model, and like we actually defined like what the heck are page objects, right? And then we went into the test methods and the object locators. We showed some examples of the page object model. One, a very basic example that we saw as a picture in the presentation, but then we also went into the Webster on Stores technical project to see a live, like a real implementation of how the page object model is going to be used within a framework. We didn't go into in depth about the framework, but we did see how it would be used. We went into the best practices for using the page object model, some of the challenges and the solutions, right? And then tools that we could use to implement the page object model. And then we talked about the page object model in different contexts. All right. So with that being said, that concludes our presentation on the page object model. I hope that you found it very helpful and insightful. And if you have any questions whatsoever, do not hesitate to reach out to me and let me know. And maybe I can do a follow-up video. We can go into more specific. Maybe you want to hear more about the test objects. Maybe you want to hear more about the test scripts. Maybe you want to hear more about the framework. Who knows? Whatever the case may be, right? Let me know, and I will definitely get back to you with more information about the page object model and the components that make it up. But that's it for today, right? That's it for this episode of Software Explorations, Concept and Overuse, hosted by yours truly, Tech Coach Ralph. Until next time, my friends, my family, this is Tech Coach Ralph signing off.
If you enjoyed the fascinating information shared in this video and you want more, be sure to hit the subscribe button to Tech Coach Ralph to be notified for new videos.